White police officer humiliates black young man, but is bitterly regretful to discover who he really is. The revelation changed everything. In vibrant Brixton, the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. John Whitman, a weary-faced white police officer with dark eyes, was heading home after a long day at work. The exhausting routine and the bitterness that accompanied him felt like a constant weight on his shoulders. He spotted a group of young people on the sidewalk, laughing and chatting. One of them, Danny Smith, a young black man with curly hair, stood out. He was lingering in front of a convenience store, a pensive expression on his face. Without a second thought, John parked his car and got out, frustration bubbling inside him. He approached Danny, who had yet to notice his presence. "What are you doing here? You know it's not safe to hang out here at night?" John questioned, his voice laced with disdain. Danny turned, surprised. "I'm just waiting for a friend. I'm not doing anything wrong." "Waiting for a friend, huh? That's what everyone says." John crossed his arms, raising an eyebrow. "You don't have anything better to do? You don't seem like the type who belongs here." Danny felt humiliation swell within him, but he tried to remain calm. "I'm just here, officer. I'm not doing anything illegal. If you really think you can hang out here just because you're the son of a human rights lawyer, you're very mistaken," John replied, his tone growing increasingly aggressive. "Society doesn't owe you anything, kid." Danny's heart raced, but he chose not to react to the provocation. "I just want to go home. I can do that without any problems." John moved closer, invading Danny's personal space. "You shouldn't be here. Leave. And if I see you again, I won't hesitate to take you to the station." The tension in the air was palpable. Danny took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Please don't do that. I'm just waiting for my friend." "Enough talk," John replied, walking away but not before casting a scornful glance at Danny. "Next time I see you, I won't be so nice." Danny watched as John walked off, feeling the injustice of the moment settle in his heart. He knew he wasn't the first to suffer this oppression, but the humiliation still stung. With a lump in his throat, he decided to record a video and share it on social media. "This needs to be told," he thought. The next day, the video spread like wildfire. The community in Brixton erupted with indignation with every view and share. Notifications flooded Danny's phone, and his name began to circulate everywhere. Meanwhile, John was at home trying to unwind after a tough day when he received a message from a colleague. "Did you see what's going on social media? The kid is talking about you." Wide-eyed, John opened his phone and quickly came across the video. He was shocked to realize that Danny was the son of Richard Smith, a renowned human rights lawyer. The weight of the situation began to settle in. "This can't be happening," he murmured to himself as the reality of the repercussions started to gnaw at his insides. The pressure on the police mounted, and he felt like an outcast in his own profession. The following hours were a whirlwind. John was summoned to an emergency meeting with his superiors. In the office, the atmosphere was tense. "Whitman, we need to discuss what happened," said his boss, a man of few smiles and many principles. "The video that spread is devastating." "What were you thinking?" "I was just doing my job," John retorted defensively, but his voice sounded hesitant. He glanced around and saw the disappointed looks from his colleagues. The feeling of superiority began to fade. "You didn't call this work. You acted immaturely and prejudicially. Danny did nothing wrong. You need to understand the impact of your actions," said a colleague. As they discussed, a wave of regret began to swell within John. He knew he had crossed a line. He thought about his life, his recent divorce, the loneliness consuming him. I didn't know who he was," John admitted, his voice faltering. "I didn't think about what I was doing." "That's not an excuse," his boss replied, shaking his head. "You need to learn to see people as individuals, not stereotypes. You need to reflect on your beliefs and actions." As the words resonated in his mind, John realized there was much more at stake than his career. The incident with Danny was not just an isolated mistake. It was a reflection of a lifetime of biases he needed to confront. Danny sat on his bed, surrounded by books and notes, but his mind was far from studying. The incident with John Whitman still echoed in his head. He looked out the window and saw the commotion in the street. The community was in an uproar, and he felt the weight of expectations pressing down on him. His phone vibrated beside him. It was a message from his father, Richard Smith. "Let's talk, son. I need you in my office." Danny sighed, got up, and prepared for the meeting. When he entered his father's office, the atmosphere was tense. Richard was sitting at his desk, a serious expression on his face. He looked at Danny, who sat down, nervous. "Danny, I saw the video. What happened is unacceptable," Richard began, his voice firm but laced with concern. "You mustn't let this define who you are." "But Dad, everyone is talking about it. It's as if I'm just a victim," Danny replied, his voice trembling. "I want to be more than that. I don't want my name to be just associated with a police scandal." Richard leaned forward, his eyes softening. "I understand, son, but you have an opportunity now. You can use this to make a difference. We can fight together." "How?" "The media is attacking us. They want a spectacle," Danny retorted, frustration rising. "We need a plan. Mobilize the community, organize a protest. Show that we won't be silenced," Richard suggested, determined. Danny looked at his father, seeing the passion in his eyes, and a spark of hope began to ignite within him. "You're right, but what about John? He's still a police officer. He needs to be held accountable," Danny said, his tone shifting from doubt to determination. "I agree. But Danny, change doesn't happen solely through punishment. Sometimes you have to give understanding a chance," Richard replied. "You mean re-education?" Danny asked, raising an eyebrow. "Exactly. Proposing a rehabilitation program could be a way to show that change is possible. If he really puts in the effort, he might realize the error of his actions," Richard said, as a silence settled in the room. Danny nodded, contemplating his father's words. Meanwhile, John was at home, surrounded by news and social media that wouldn't stop talking about him. The community's outrage hit him like a storm. He sat on the couch, his head in his hands, when his phone rang. It was a colleague from the police department. "John, have you seen what's happening? The pressure is mounting. We need you at our meeting tomorrow," the colleague said, his voice tense. "I'm aware," John replied, feeling bitterness grow inside him. "But what can I do? What I did was wrong, and now I'm paying the price. We need a strategy. We can't let this take you down. You need to defend yourself," the colleague insisted. John took a deep breath. "And how do I do that? How do I defend myself against something I caused?" The next day brought protests in the streets of Brixton. The community mobilized, carrying signs and shouting slogans. Danny, alongside his father, watched the scene with a mix of pride and apprehension. He held up a sign that read, "Justice and respect for all." The crowd responded with shouts of support, and he felt the energy around him. "Look at this, Dad. People are coming together," Danny exclaimed, his heart racing at the sight of so many supporters. "That's what we need, Danny. This is your voice. Use it," Richard replied, a smile of encouragement on his face. However, deep down, Danny knew the battle wouldn't be easy. John, on the other hand, watched the protests on television, feeling increasingly isolated. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the determined faces of the community. The reality of his actions hit him hard, and he was uncertain about his position. When the protests became headline news, John was called into a meeting with his superiors. He entered the room with a heavy heart, seeing the serious faces of his colleagues. The captain began to speak. "Whitman, the pressure on us is increasing. We need a plan of action. What do you suggest?" the captain asked, crossing his arms. I don't know. I made a mistake, and I'm willing to face the consequences," John replied, his voice low. "You can do more. We need to show that we're willing to change. How about suggesting a re-education program? You could help build a dialogue with the community," a colleague suggested. "Do you really think that will work? That they will listen to us?" John questioned, doubt evident in his eyes. "It's the first step. If you want to redeem yourself, you need to get involved," the captain responded, with a hopeful expression. The idea of re-education began to take shape in John's mind, but he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The fight for justice was just beginning, and both he and Danny would have to confront their personal demons before moving forward. John Whitman sat in a hard chair in a brightly lit room, surrounded by unfamiliar faces that looked at him with a mix of skepticism and distrust. The re-education program had started, and he was there, finally confronting the consequences of his actions. The instructor, a middle-aged man named Carlos, began the session with an air of determination. "Today we're going to talk about prejudice and its consequences. Each of you is here because in some way you failed to recognize the humanity in others. Let's start with a question. What do you understand by empathy?" Carlos looked around, waiting for someone to respond. A tall man with visible tattoos on his arms raised his hand. "Empathy is when you try to understand what the other person feels, right? Not just looking at the surface, but really putting yourself in their shoes." "Exactly," Carlos confirmed, smiling. Now, I'm going to ask you to share a moment when you failed to be empathetic. Let's start with you, John. All eyes turned to John, and he felt the weight of their expectations. He took a deep breath, his voice hesitant as he began. I thought I was just doing my job. When I approached a young man who seemed to just be standing on the street, I didn't see a human being. I saw a problem that needed to be solved. And instead of trying to understand his situation, I acted with prejudice. And how do you think that affected that young man? Carlos encouraged him to continue. I'm not sure, John admitted, his jaw tightening. But I was told that he is the son of a human rights lawyer. I didn't think about the consequences of my behavior. To me, he was just another statistic. And what if you put yourself in his shoes? Carlos asked. How would you feel if someone treated you that way without knowing your story? Carlos's words echoed in John's mind as he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to imagine the pain and humiliation that Danny must have felt. Guilt tightened in his heart. The silence in the room was heavy, but he knew he needed to continue. I would feel dehumanized, like my existence didn't matter, he replied, his voice stronger now. And worse, like who I am isn't relevant. The session continued, and John was challenged to listen to the stories of other participants. A young man named Malik, who had spent years in prison, shared his experience of being treated like a criminal just because of his appearance. People don't see my story. They see my color, and that's all. I was judged without a chance to defend myself, Malik said, his eyes shining with emotion. That's how I feel, John murmured, almost to himself. I didn't want to be that kind of police officer, but I let my prejudice take over. As the weeks passed, John began to bond with the other participants. One of the former prisoners, named Raphael, became an unexpected friend. During breaks, they talked about their lives, and John listened intently to Raphael's experiences. You know, John, I made mistakes, but that doesn't define me, Raphael said, his gaze steady. I'm more than my past. We all are more than our failures. But what if people can never see that? John questioned, frustration evident in his voice. What if I can never change how I'm viewed? You can't control how others see you, but you can control your actions, Raphael replied, surprisingly calm. What matters is what you do from now on. If you truly want to change, start with small steps. Do good, one day at a time. These conversations began to shape how John viewed the world. He made an effort to understand each person's life story, listening carefully and allowing himself to feel the pain and struggles they carried. A new perspective was emerging within him, but there was still a long way to go. One afternoon, as he reflected on what he had learned, John envisioned Danny, the young man he had wronged. He wondered if he could one day meet him and offer a sincere apology. What I did was cruel, he murmured to himself, and all I can do now is try to be a better person. Weeks passed in a whirlwind of emotions, and John finally began to believe that change was possible. He was learning to see the world through others' eyes, and for the first time he was starting to understand that the true cost of ignorance was not only the pain inflicted on others, but also the loss of his own humanity. Danny was nervous as he prepared for the mediation session. He knew it would be a crucial moment not just for him, but also for John. The atmosphere in the room was charged with tension. The walls, covered in a neutral tone, seemed to absorb the anxiety that hung in the air. A long, dark wooden table separated the two men, who were as different as night and day. Danny looked at John, who sat across from him with a closed expression, as if he were shielding himself from something he couldn't quite understand. Do you know why we're here, John? Danny asked, trying to keep his voice steady, even though he felt tremors in his hands. I just want you to understand the impact your actions had on my life. John took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't know, he murmured, as if trying to justify his actions in some way. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and the sensation of regret began to mix with anger. I'm a police officer. I was taught to see things a certain way. And that way doesn't include people like me, right? Danny replied, his voice firmer now. You saw me as a criminal before you even knew who I was. You judged me by the color of my skin and not by my humanity. The tension in the room escalated, and both men seemed to be in an emotional battleground. John looked up, meeting Danny's eyes for the first time. There was a spark of understanding there, but also an insurmountable barrier. He felt like a man who had built a fortress throughout his life, only to watch it crumble in the face of the truth. I grew up in an environment where the fear of others was taught, John said, his voice trembling. "But I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be the enemy." Danny leaned forward, his expression softening a bit. "So what do you plan to do about it? Because honestly, this isn't just about you and me. It's about everyone who has been affected by this kind of thinking." John hesitated, his heart heavy with the weight of Danny's words. I want to change. I want to learn. But it's hard, you know?" He looked at Danny, a young man full of hope, while he himself felt so lost. "Hard for you?" Danny responded, frustration starting to seep through. "Try being me for a day. Try living with the fear I live with. That's hard, John. That's the reality for many of us." The conversation continued, and the words began to flow like a river that had been dammed for too long. As they discussed their experiences, the room began to feel less like a confrontation arena and more like a space for dialogue. John started to share about his childhood, about how he too had faced challenges and prejudices, albeit in a completely different way. "My father, he was a tough man. He taught me to be strong, to show no weakness," John said, the pain of his memories evident on his face. "But that made me blind to the pain of others." Danny listened attentively, beginning to see a crack in John's armor. "Are you saying you suffered too? But that didn't give you the empathy necessary to not act as you did with me?" "I didn't realize what I was doing was wrong," John confessed, his voice almost a whisper. "I thought I was doing my job, protecting society." "And who protects society from you, John?" Danny asked, his voice carrying a weight of indignation. "That's the question. You need to understand that your view of protection is limited. You need to open your eyes." The conversation unfolded, and as the two men shared their stories, a tenuous connection began to form between them. John felt a mix of shame and hope. Could there be a path to redemption? Could he truly become an agent of change? The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The defenses of both seemed to dissolve slowly, giving way to a painful but necessary understanding. Danny, recognizing John's internal struggle, decided to take a step forward. "I don't want you to feel guilty about all of this, John, but I want you to commit to learning, to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for all of us." "I promise, Danny," John replied, sincerity emerging from the depths of his soul. "I want to make this right, for you and for everyone else who has been affected by my prejudice." "Then let's work together," Danny said, a slight smile emerging on his face. "Let's show that it's possible to change, that it's possible to learn from our mistakes." The room, which had once felt like a battleground, was now a space where hope began to bloom. Both men, despite their differences, were ready to face the future, a future that hopefully would be shaped by understanding and empathy. The atmosphere in Brixton was tense, and the anticipation surrounding John Whitman's trial grew with each passing day. That morning he looked at himself in the mirror, observing the man reflected back. The deep bags under his eyes and his worn expression betrayed the internal battle he was facing. He dressed in his uniform, but the pride he used to feel was now replaced by an overwhelming weight. The pressure from his fellow officers and the fear of public backlash left him in a constant state of unease. Meanwhile, Danny Smith prepared for the day that would change the course of his life. He had received unwavering support from his father, Richard, who had stood by him since the video of the incident went viral. "Are you ready, son?" Richard asked, his tone one of encouragement but also concern. Danny took a deep breath, trying to steady his anxiety. "I am, Dad. I want my voice to be heard. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." On the way to the courthouse, the city pulsed with the energy of protests. Activist groups gathered, holding signs that called for justice and equality. The sound of supportive cheers echoed through the streets, and Danny felt a mix of emotion and responsibility as he witnessed the unity of his community. "This is bigger than me," he thought, admiring the strength of his fellow citizens. He knew he had a role to play and was determined not to let fear overwhelm him. As he entered the courtroom, the tension was palpable. John was sitting in a corner, watching Danny with an expression that blended guilt and apprehension. He felt under pressure, as if every action of his was being scrutinized. The gazes of the other officers felt like spears, and he knew that any sign of weakness could spell his doom. "You can't show weakness now, John," he muttered to himself, trying to bolster his resolve. The judge entered the room, and a reverent silence spread. The trial began, and the atmosphere grew denser as evidence was presented. Danny prepared for his testimony, each beat of his heart echoing in the stillness. He looked at his father, who gave him a subtle gesture of support. Taking a deep breath, Danny stood up and walked toward the witness stand. His eyes were fixed on John, who now seemed a different man, vulnerable and broken. "I would like to share my story," Danny began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "What happened to me was not just an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of prejudice and discrimination that many of us face every day." He looked at the audience, where faces displayed empathy and understanding. "When I was approached by John, it wasn't just a police officer doing his job. It was the manifestation of a system that often fails to see the value in people like me." John felt his heart tighten. Danny's words pierced his consciousness, awakening feelings he had tried to bury. Each phrase Danny uttered seemed to echo his own failures. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to concentrate and not be consumed by guilt. After Danny's testimony, it was John's turn to stand. His mind was a whirlwind, and he knew he couldn't use the same excuses he always had. I'm not here to justify my actions," he began, his voice trembling. "I'm here to acknowledge that I failed. I let my prejudice and bitterness blind me to the truth, and I'm truly sorry for that." John's words were met with murmurs in the room. He could feel the anger and disbelief from some, but he also noticed a few faces that seemed sympathetic. He was standing there, exposed, and the vulnerability was terrifying. "But I want to change. I want to learn about the injustices I've perpetuated and become part of the solution, not the problem." The judge listened attentively, and the room fell silent. Danny looked at John, questioning whether the sincerity of the man who had humiliated him was genuine or just a performance. What would happen next could not only change their lives, but also the course of racial relations in Brixton. As the day progressed, the tension intensified. Danny and John were at a turning point, not just for themselves but for an entire community. The pressure of the audience became a unifying force, and both knew that what was to come would be decisive. The courtroom was not just a space for justice but a battlefield of ideas, a place where change could finally begin to take shape. The courtroom was packed, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, looked at those present before banging the gavel, signaling the start of the trial. Danny, sitting in the front row, felt his heart race. He glanced to the side and saw his father, Richard Smith, who gave him an encouraging look. Danny took a deep breath, trying to focus. He knew this was his chance to tell his story. Across the room, John Whitman stood with a tense and nervous expression. The police uniform felt heavier than ever, as if every stitch carried the weight of his mistakes. He knew that what was at stake was not only his career but also his dignity. As he looked at Danny, he felt a mix of guilt and anger, a fierce internal struggle that consumed him. "Officer Whitman, please present your defense," the judge ordered, his firm voice echoing in the room. John straightened up, trying to project an image of confidence. "I acted according to protocol in a situation I considered threatening. Danny's behavior made me feel unsafe, and—" "Your behavior, Officer Whitman, was disproportionate and prejudiced," Richard interrupted, rising from his seat. "Danny was not a threat. He was simply standing in front of a store. What you did was not only a violation of protocol, but a manifestation of prejudice. What do you have to say about that?" The room fell silent. John swallowed hard, the words heavy in his throat. He looked at Danny, who was now standing ready to testify. The tension escalated and all eyes turned to him. Danny began to speak, his voice trembling but determined. "I was just waiting for a friend. I never thought I would be approached that way. I am a student, and all I wanted was peace. What happened to me was not just an isolated incident. It was an experience that left deep scars." Danny's words reverberated in the courtroom, and the audience began to murmur, some with expressions of empathy, others with indignation. John, in turn, felt his guilt intensify. How could he have treated someone like that? "I am not just the son of a human rights lawyer. I am a person," Danny continued. "And what happened to other people, other young people like me, is a reality we cannot ignore. Prejudice is not just a word. It's an experience that many of us live with every day." Danny's words struck like knives, cutting through John's defense. He looked at the ground, feeling the weight of his actions. Richard, sensing John's vulnerability, decided to step forward. "Officer Whitman, you are here to defend yourself, but I ask you to also define yourself as a man. How do you feel right now?" The question hung in the air, and John hesitated. I feel that I didn't do what I should have done. I let my prejudices guide me, and I was wrong." His voice faltered, and the room fell silent once more. At that moment, new evidence was presented. The prosecution's attorney approached the stand and began to play a video that started rolling on the screen. The footage showed John in other confrontational situations where his behavior was aggressive and excessive. The murmurs grew louder, and among the audience, some stood up in disbelief. "This is not just an isolated incident, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the attorney said, his voice firm. "This is a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed." John stared at the video, his face paling. He felt exposed, as if all his mistakes were laid bare for the world to see. The weight of reality crashed down on him, and he realized he could no longer hide behind his defenses. Danny looked at John, feeling a mix of compassion and anger. He knew the struggle wasn't just against John, but against a system that perpetuated prejudice. "We all have the power to change," Danny said, turning to the audience. "But that requires the courage to face the mistakes of the past. I hope we can all learn from this." John's gaze met Danny's for a brief moment, and amid all the tension, they shared a fleeting understanding. Both were fighting, each in their own way, in search of redemption. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for the next decision, the next word that would shape the future for both of them. The courtroom was electrically charged, a palpable mix of anxiety and anticipation. The chairs were filled with community members, journalists, and protesters, all awaiting a decision that could change the course of many lives. Danny Smith, standing at the front, felt his heart pounding, but the determination in his eyes showed he was there not just to seek justice, but to represent all those who had been silenced by prejudice and abuses of power. John Whitman, on the other hand, sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped, and his expression etched with tension. He felt the weight of everyone's gaze upon him, the pressure of the media and the community's outrage. He knew that the revelation of a video showing him acting violently in other situations had changed everything. This was no longer just a personal case. It had become a symbol of the systemic failures that permeated the police force and society. The judge entered the room, and a respectful silence followed. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and looked around the room before making a gesture that signaled the beginning of the session. "We are here today to hear the conclusions of this case and determine the consequences of Officer John Whitman's actions. Let's proceed with the closing statements." Danny, who had prepared for this moment, stood up, took a deep breath. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice steady. "I am not just a statistic. I am a young man with dreams and aspirations, but I was treated like a criminal simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It is a reality that many of us face every day." He glanced at John, who averted his gaze, unable to bear the weight of that connection. The audience was rapt, capturing every word. "I am not here just to seek justice for myself, but for all those who have suffered and continue to suffer at the hands of an institution that should protect us. This trial represents an opportunity for us to begin rebuilding trust between the police and the community." John felt a chill run down his spine. He knew his actions had caused pain, but hearing Danny speak with such passion and sincerity struck a blow to his pride. He stood up, feeling the need to defend himself even though it would not be easy. "I acknowledge that I made mistakes," he began, his voice trembling. "But I am not a monster. I'm trying to change. I'm trying to understand what I did wrong." The room murmured, tension rising. A reporter whispered to a colleague, and cameras began capturing every expression, searching for reactions. "You're trying to redeem yourself, but what about the lives you've destroyed? What do you have to say to all those who felt threatened by you?" Danny interjected, his voice raised but controlled. "Your apologies aren't enough, John. Real change demands more than words." The audience was attentive, and the judge watched the interaction with a critical eye. "Mr. Whitman, would you like to respond?" he asked. I just want everyone to understand that I am not just what you see. I am a human being who failed, and I don't want that to define who I am," John said, vulnerability beginning to show in his voice. He appeared more like a lost man than an arrogant officer, and that began to resonate with some in the room. Tension escalated when new evidence was presented. The prosecution displayed the video showing John acting out of control in other situations. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Murmurs turned into shouts of outrage, and the audience became a sea of emotions. "This is a pattern of behavior," a woman shouted from the back of the room, her voice echoing off the walls. The judge banged his gavel, trying to restore order. "Silence, please. We must maintain order in this room." Danny was shocked but relieved at the same time. The truth was finally coming to light. "This isn't just about me," he declared. "It's about what this city needs, a true and lasting change. And that starts with accountability." The court's decision was approaching, and the tension was palpable. John looked around, realizing his life would never be the same. He was caught between the desire to defend himself and the reality of his actions. The judge signaled for the room to calm down, and prepared to deliver the verdict that could determine John's future and Danny's hope. After the verdict that sentenced John Whitman to a re-education program, a new phase began in his life. He sat in a simple chair in a room lit by harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by unfamiliar faces sharing stories of pain and struggle. "My name is John, and I am a police officer," he began, his voice hesitant yet firm. The group looked at him, some with suspicion, others with curiosity. He continued, "I'm here because I made a mistake that deeply hurt someone, and now I'm trying to understand how that happened." The program facilitator, a middle-aged woman named Clara, smiled encouragingly. "Don't worry, John. This is a safe space. The goal here is to learn and grow. Are you ready for that?" John nodded, feeling the weight of his actions still very present. He knew he was there to face his prejudices, but the journey wouldn't be easy. Over the following weeks, he dedicated himself to listening to the life stories of ex-offenders and activists, people who faced discrimination and injustice in ways he could never have imagined. One participant, a woman named Layla, shared her experience of being wrongfully imprisoned. "I just wanted to live my life in peace, but the color of my skin made me a target," she said. Her voice choked with emotion. John felt a lump in his throat. He had not considered the impact that his stance had on the lives of the people who shared the same city as him. After a particularly intense session, John approached Layla. "I'm sorry for what you went through. I feel ashamed," he confessed, sincerity in his eyes. Layla looked at him, weighing his words. "Shame is the first step, but you need to do more than that. It's time to act and change your mindset," she replied, her gaze determined. John realized that his past actions had not only affected Danny, but also reverberated throughout the community. As time went on, he began to form bonds with the other program participants. An ex-convict named Marcus became his friend. They often talked after the sessions, and John listened to Marcus's stories about how he fought to overcome his past. "You have to understand, John. Life has never been easy for me, but I didn't let it define me. You shouldn't let your past actions define who you are either," Marcus said with a hopeful smile. Meanwhile, at home, John reflected on his life. He started keeping a journal, recording his thoughts and feelings. "True change is painful, but necessary," he wrote in one of his entries. He knew that the journey of redemption would be long, but he was determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. In one session, John had the opportunity to share his own experience. He stood up, his heart racing. "I made a terrible mistake, a mistake that harmed a young woman and her family. I saw him only as a suspect, without recognizing the human behind that image," he confessed, his voice choked with emotion. The group listened in silence, and Clara encouraged him to continue. "I don't want to be that man anymore. I want to learn. I want to change," he concluded, his vulnerability laid bare. The program's impact began to shape John in ways he never imagined. During one of the meetings, he encountered a former co-worker, David, who had been affected by his actions. The reunion was charged with emotion. "I didn't know you were here, John," David said, a mix of anger and sadness in his voice. "I always believed you were better than this." "I'm trying to change, David. I'm here to learn and redeem myself," John replied earnestly. David looked at him, assessing the sincerity in his friend's words. "I hope you succeed. You know this isn't easy, right? But I'm rooting for you." Over time, John felt more comfortable in his new skin. He started participating in community events, listening and learning about the struggles and joys of the Brixton community. On one such occasion, he crossed paths with Danny, who was becoming an active voice in the fight for justice. The look exchanged between them was heavy with history and emotion, but also with potential for mutual understanding. It was a new era for John. He was beginning to understand that true change wasn't just about redeeming himself, but also about listening to and learning from others. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Danny Smith felt a mix of nervousness and excitement as he walked across the university campus. The vibrant atmosphere with students moving in all directions reminded him of his dreams and aspirations that, for a time, felt out of reach. However, He was now determined to resume his studies and become a public defender. The struggle he faced after the incident with John Whitman not only shaped his identity but also solidified his purpose. He wanted to use his experience to help others who had gone through similar situations. "Danny, wait!" a familiar voice called out, and he turned to see his father, Richard Smith, approaching. His father's presence always brought comfort. Richard was his safe harbor, a guide amidst emotional storms. "Hey, Dad, I'm so excited for my first class today," Danny replied, his smile lighting up his face. "I'm proud of you too. Remember, you're not just there to learn, but to make a difference. Your voice is powerful and you can use it to help others," Richard encouraged, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know, Dad. That's what motivates me. I want young people facing difficulties to know they have someone fighting for them, that they aren't alone," Danny said with determination. As they walked together, Danny felt the pressure of expectations, but also a renewed sense of hope. He recalled all the conversations he had with Richard about social justice and the fight against discrimination. Each of those discussions gave him the courage to move forward. At the start of the class, the professor, a renowned civil rights attorney, gave an inspiring introduction. "Today, we're going to discuss the importance of public defense and how each of you can be an agent of change. Remember, justice isn't just a word, it's a daily struggle, and you have the power to be the voice for those who don't have one," he declared, looking directly at the students. Danny felt energized. He knew he was in the right place, and this only increased his determination to become an effective defender. What he didn't expect was to run into John Whitman in the hallway after class. John was there, no longer the arrogant officer he once knew, but a changed man trying to redeem himself. Their eyes met, and the tension was palpable. "Danny," John began hesitantly, I just wanted to congratulate you on returning to university." "That's incredible." Danny, surprised and cautious, replied, "Thank you, John, but I don't know if you truly understand how difficult it was for me to get here. I know I messed up, and every day is a reminder of the impact my actions had. I'm trying to change, and the last thing I want is for you to feel like I'm here just to redeem myself. I want you to know that I'm rooting for you," John said, his sincerity clear. "I appreciate that, but your change doesn't erase what happened. The pain is still there," Danny responded, his tone firm but not hostile. "I understand, and that's why I'm here, to learn and listen. Your testimony has had a much greater impact than you can imagine," John declared, trying to connect genuinely. Danny looked at John, searching for sincerity in his eyes. He saw a man dealing with his own internal battles. "If you really want to change, then do it the right way. Fight for justice, not just for yourself, but for everyone who has been treated unfairly," Danny advised, his voice full of emotion. "I promise I will do that. I want to be better. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to help wherever I can," John replied, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Let's see. Change takes time. But for now, you can start by listening to people's stories. The truth lies within those stories," Danny said, stepping away, feeling the tension ease a bit. As Danny walked to his next class, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he felt more empowered. He was ready to face the challenges, not just as a student, but as a voice for those who didn't have one. The fight for justice was now his mission. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and emotion. The community auditorium, decorated with banners and posters calling for justice and equality, was packed. John and Danny, now both symbols of transformation, prepared to share their stories. The soft stage lights illuminated their faces, and the audience was eager to hear what they had to say. Danny went up on stage first. He took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice strong yet filled with emotion. "Today, we're here not just to talk about what happened, but to discuss what we can do together to change the future." The audience applauded, the positive energy palpable in the air. "I'm just a young person who has gone through a tough time, but I'm not just a number in a statistic. I am Daniel Smith, and I have dreams, just like all of you." He looked out at the crowd and saw familiar faces, friends, and even strangers supporting his cause. "The injustice I faced is not an isolated case. It's an example of what many of us deal with daily, and this needs to stop." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. "We must unite, fight, and ensure that everyone has a safe and respected place in our society." On the other side of the stage, John watched intently. He still felt like an intruder, but the change he had experienced had made him more aware of his responsibility. Now it was his turn. He stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding. "I am John Whitman, and for a long time I was the voice of prejudice and discrimination," he began, sincerity evident in his voice. "But today, I'm here to say that change is possible. I am not the man I once was. I am learning, growing, and most importantly, listening." The audience was silent, absorbing every word. "I made terrible mistakes. I didn't just hurt a young man, but I also contributed to a system that perpetuates pain and inequality," he continued, shame visible in his eyes. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm here to take responsibility for my actions and to commit to doing better." Danny looked at John, feeling a wave of empathy. He remembered all the battles he had faced and how John's journey was also marked by pain and transformation. "True change begins with empathy," Danny said, interrupting his thoughts. "We need to listen to each other, understand our stories, and most importantly, support one another. At the end of the day, we are all human." The audience began to applaud, and John smiled, feeling the warmth of acceptance. He turned to Danny, who gave him a look of understanding. "We all have a story, and our story doesn't end here," Danny continued. "It's only the beginning. What we can do together from now on is what truly matters." After their presentation, the atmosphere in the auditorium was one of camaraderie and hope. People approached John and Danny, offering words of support and gratitude. "You two are an inspiration," said a middle-aged woman, tears in her eyes. "I believe we can change our community." John, feeling more at ease, replied, "We're not heroes. We're just trying to do what's right." He looked at Danny, who nodded in agreement. "But if each of us does our part, we can create a better future." Danny turned to John. "And it starts with education and dialogue. We must keep talking, listening, and learning from one another." He remembered how his own journey had been fueled by meaningful conversations. That's how we build a path to change. The event concluded, but the connection between them and the community had strengthened. As they left, John and Danny walked side by side, feeling that despite the challenges that still lay ahead, they were ready to face them together. The new relationship they had formed was based on understanding and empathy, a crucial step toward building a fairer and more equitable future.